We have breaking news on this Tuesday per Global Golf Post Ron Green Jr. LIV Golf will not receive official World Golf ranking points as the OWGR has turned down the organization's formal request. This quote from the OWGR chairman Peter Dawson in a letter to LIV Golf CEO Greg Norman. The board committee met recently to again review your OWGR submission in light of your latest responses to the committee's questions and concerns. At the meeting, the board committee unanimously determined that at this time, the LIV Tour will not be recognized as an eligible golf tour in the OWGR system. Do we have this quote from Peter Dawson to the Global Golf Post? This is entirely technical. OWGR has no hostility toward LIV whatsoever. The important point is this is not about the players. LIV players are self-evidently good enough to be ranked. There is no doubt about that. This is about should a tour whose formats are so different and whose qualification criteria are so different, can they be ranked equitably with other tours who conform to the OWGR norm and have more competition to them than perhaps the closed shop that is LIV? Ron Green Jr. of the Global Golf Post broke this story, and he joins us now. Ron, we appreciate your time. What are the nuts and bolts of this story in your mind?
Well, I think you hit on them right there, that they have, for the time being, denied LIV points. We go back when this whole thing started. One of the selling points for LIV Golf was you're going to be able to get World Golf ranking points. Actually, they did not technically apply for those until after their second event last year. There have been numerous conversations between Greg Norman, Peter Dawson, and others about this. It's sort of been out there kind of quiet now, waiting on this decision. I think the thing that struck me was in Peter Dawson's letter to Greg Norman and Gary Davison, and in the conversation this morning, he sort of struck a conciliatory tone, like, this is not the way we want it to be, but under our guidelines, as he said, this is a technical thing. They don't qualify. And he sort of laid out ways that this could be rectified in the future, that they'll feel free to bring back another solution, or, if you make some changes, we'll look at them. But for the time being, it's the status quo.
And Ron, some of the concerns Peter Dawson specified they're mostly around format and the idea of no cut and the qualification process by which people enter and leave the LIV Golf ecosystem. But he also mentioned the idea of individual and team competitions being conducted side by side and the difficulty of reconciling that with the rankings. That wouldn't seem like something that's immediately fixable if you're Greg Norman. They've really kind of nailed their colours to the mast in terms of this is the way they want it to run.
Yeah, as Peter said, there's a way to mathematically take the format, the 54 holes and no cut and all that, and make it work in their system. But it's the other things, how team competition might impact how an individual plays. That is a big deal to them. It's not like anything else to deal with that. That gets in the way, as does the fact that you have players who are under contract. Certain players, it doesn't matter how they, in his words, underperform, they're still going to be there. There's no relegation for them. And the pathway in is really limited. Some of it could be just contractual. There are 3 or 4 spots that can be open. I think they want to see more of that. As Dawson said, there's thousands of players every week trying to get a spot in a tournament that would qualify for World Golf ranking points. And then to suddenly just have your structure set up so that no matter what you do, you're still going to keep playing. That does not work in the equation there. And I think that is the biggest sticking point at this point, is my sense.
Ron, in light of the framework agreement between LIV Golf, the PGA Tour, and DP World Tour, in light of the fact that Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the PIF chairman, played golf last week at the Alfred Dunhill Links with Martin Slumbers, CEO of the R&A, with Peter Dawson Thursday and Friday, respectively, is any part of you surprised that LIV Golf was denied official World Golf ranking points?
I think they went very much by their handbook and by their rules. Keith Pelley and Jay Monahan were not part of this discussion or decision. I might be surprised if they didn't have a sense that this was coming. I'm sure, because they had to ask the question. But no, I think there's obviously a lot in the game is in flux right now. Talking to Peter, he said, there are actually some PGA Tour events, the formats that they're talking about for next year, they want to take a look at themselves. But I think if we get this agreement to the next step, then everything changes again. As Peter Dawson said, we understand change and we want to be flexible. He said it diminishes the rankings if Bryson DeChambeau and Dustin Johnson are not where they should be. But that's the way it works right now. So they don't see this as a way. They can't do it right now, but they have given them at least a hint or an idea of how to move forward. And again, 3 months from now, if there's a total agreement, we're entering this whole new realm of professional golf. That just changes what they have to deal with.
Ron, we've heard very little from Greg Norman ever since the announcement on June 6th of that framework agreement. LIV is playing this week in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. What do you expect the reaction is going to be on the ground over there to this news?
They've been pretty outspoken saying how unjust they think it is, and I would expect their disappointment will be amplified with this. Again, I don't know if they had a sense it was coming, but they have heralded this since the outset, since they actually began playing, that this was all part of what was going to make them special. And they're going to be part of the ecosystem. And as much as they've tried, I think this is a big point of it. And they're still on the outside looking in. I mean, again, Peter Dawson said, there's a lot of good things about progress in golf and finding different formats and looking at the game in a little different light. And, he sort of encouraged that, but it doesn't work for what we're doing here to include those players. So I'm sure there will be a lot of guys who are really disappointed. There'll probably be some pretty sharp comments. And again, when they get back, I guess Miami is next week for the season finale. Here in the States, there'll be more questions and comments about it. So again, I don't think they're surprised, but I'm sure they're very disappointed.
And lots still to be determined, as we know. Ron, great reporting. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Folks, take a look at the LIV Golf OWGR timeline. You recall it was last summer that LIV Golf submitted the application to receive official World Golf ranking points. In fact, at the time last year, the entire roster of LIV golfers wrote a letter to Peter Dawson calling for world ranking points to be awarded immediately and retroactively to June, saying LIV without rankings is like college football without the SEC or the Big Ten or Argentina, Belgium, and England. Not eligible for FIFA. August of 2022, Greg Norman writes a letter to LIV players that OWGR is severely compromised without LIV's inclusion. October, LIV formed strategic alliance with Middle East and North Africa Tour in effort to secure official World Golf ranking points. December of 2022, the OWGR announces that Mexican Professional Golf Tour will begin to earn points in January of 2023. LIV's status still undetermined. Then in May of this year, Seth Waugh says OWGR and LIV have been collegial in their discussions, although OWGR hadn't heard from LIV in weeks. And then October, LIV's application for OWGR points is turned down. That broken today by Ron Green Jr. of the Global Golf Post. And this from Peter Dawson, the OWGR chairman, on the future. If LIV could find a way to come up with more open competition style and relegation, we would certainly consider that. There should be many more vacancies than perhaps there are. I don't think it's fair to the other 24 eligible tours and the thousands of players trying to get a start each week. Eamon, your thoughts on this breaking news? Maybe a bit of a surprise considering this framework agreement and where we thought perhaps LIV Golf was going.
Well, I think it's important that the official World Golf ranking were to be seen to be outside of that framework agreement. And the notable parties to that agreement, Jay Monahan and Keith Pelly, had recused themselves from any decision-making in this. But it really is a formal notification, as it were, that Greg Norman sold these guys a bill of goods. Everything he's told them was a lie. Every single thing. He told them they could cherry-pick PGA Tour events. The court said no. He told them that they could play DP World Tour events. A tribunal over there said no. He told them that they would be hailed as visionaries. Public opinion certainly said no on that one. He told them he could play all the majors. The majors said that's not happening. And he told them they would have world ranking points. That's not happening either. And the Saudis are very accustomed to waiving whatever rules or customs or standards don't suit them, certainly as it relates to human rights and extrajudicial murders. But on official World Golf ranking points, they are simply being told they will not debase the system of the ranking simply to accommodate business decisions that individual players have made.
I don't think anyone's going to argue that Brooks Koepka, Dustin Johnson, Bryson DeChambeau are still not, three of the best players in the world of golf. But for those players that are on the outside, that are not major championship eligible, like those three players, what's their recourse? Where do they go from here? Do they have to just wait to see what this framework agreement ultimately bears?
Which will in itself be separate from LIV Golf. I mean, it's very clear. Greg Norman was very clear at the outset that they would not change the format from the team event. They would not change the ecosystem. That
right.
Really, guys get into that ecosystem, the 48-man fields, on the whim of Greg Norman. There really is not a qualification mechanism in, and as Ron Green just pointed out, that some people are contractually exempt from being relegated out of it
right.
for poor play. So that was always going to be a tough sell in terms of this. You're going to hear players say, well, if the ranking doesn't show Dustin Johnson in the top 10 in the world, it's unfair. It's nonsense. Dustin Johnson is exactly where he needs to be in the world ranking now because Dustin Johnson is bearing the result of the business decision that he happened to make. These guys think that the rules ought to be rewritten or ignored simply to accommodate the business decision they chose to make with full clarity on what the possible consequences are. Now they're being told to pound sand and they're not going to like it.
Do you think this was a close call for the OWGR, a difficult decision when you think of the fact that the elements required to get official World Golf ranking points, you have to have a 36-hole cut, for example, the field size and average of 75, a system of Monday qualifying. LIV Golf falls short in so many of those elements.
There's a technical argument here and there's a political argument here, and you can see Peter Dawson in his letter trying to straddle both. In fact, he said last week in an interview at the Dunhill Links when he played with Yasser Al-Rumayyan of the Public Investment Fund that Yasser is bringing a lot of money into the game and that ought to be embraced and welcomed. Well, there's a lot of people who don't actually think that it ought to be embraced and welcomed, but certainly that is the reality and what looks to be the reality going forward with all of the tours. So Peter Dawson's straddling that line, but on their own published criteria, it was very difficult, borderline impossible, for the official World Golf Rankings to contort itself to be able to accommodate the way LIV Golf goes. And I keep going back to the LIV event in Orlando, back just before the Masters. Sebastian Munoz, in an interview after it, he was one stroke behind Brooks Koepka on the 18th green and said he did not aggressively go for a birdie putt, which would have tied Brooks, because he had a one-stroke lead in the team event, and he was protecting that. So when you have these kind of team considerations that are undermining the credibility of individual competition, it's awfully hard to treat that seriously, much less figure out how it could be equitably ranked against other tours where players aren't doing that.
Yeah, LIV Golf has the players. They don't have the format. You said from the outset that Greg Norman would not change, would not contort LIV Golf, change the format. 54 holes, shotgun start, no cut. Can you envision a scenario where LIV Golf does bend its own format, bend its own rules to more comply with what the OWGR is asking for?
I don't see it happening imminently, and it's very unclear what the future of LIV Golf is under this framework agreement, and it's very unlikely that the framework agreement will be consummated into a definitive deal before the end of this year, which was their initial deadline. That's most likely to happen well into next year, based on conversations I've had with people. But the actual future of LIV Golf beyond 2024 would probably be determined by what happens in that definitive agreement. And if there is no definitive agreement and LIV continues on its own in its own ecosystem, then they may be more inclined to actually change formats to try to make it a valid tour under the World Golf Rankings. And in fairness, as much as I despise the sourcing of the money, if they meet the criteria, they ought to be given the points. The problem is they don't meet the criteria and think they ought to be getting the points anyway.
From your reporting, and we've heard Brooks Koepka on Netflix talk about the injuries he faced, the reasons for his decisions on leaving the PGA Tour and going to LIV. In light of a day like today with the news, with LIV Golf being denied official World Golf ranking points, do you think there are other players beyond Brooks Koepka in your reporting and conversations that are second-guessing their decision?
I'm not even sure Brooks Koepka is second-guessing his decision. He's proven that given limited opportunity against the other best players in the world, he can accumulate enough points to remain in the top 20 in the official World Golf ranking now and play his way into other major championships.
And win, as he's proven as well.
Exactly, but there are other players who don't have the life raft that he has, or that a Phil Mickelson has, other guys who've earned that status going forward. I think it's going to be tough for those guys to play their way back, because ultimately they're shut out of the two main tours where points can be accumulated. And now they find themselves, as Graham McDowell has recently, you're playing in Singapore and other places where there aren't that many points at stake to begin with. And trying to play well in smaller events to try to accumulate enough points to keep yourself relevant. But ultimately, it's a decision that these guys have made, and they're kind of locked into now.
The PGA Tour was the home for a lot of these players for many, many years. You have to wonder maybe if the PGA Tour will be a life raft for some of these players who are starving for official World Golf ranking points.
Well, whether or not they're welcome in that life raft is going to remain to be seen, I guess, in the coming months.